I do want to rewind a bit. So we've already jumped into like current Yu-Gi-Oh, and we're gonna go back to it. But I want to turn back the clock because you are the Yu-Gi-Oh historian. How did you even get into Yu-Gi-Oh, Joe? Like how did this even start? Where did you begin?
It was the television show, a story that a lot of people have said. I've listened to quite a lot of podcasts from a lot of old school players, and a lot of them start in a very similar point, which is watching the television show. And for me, the first time I ever saw that the television show translated to actual product was a trip to the mall. It was the Burlington Mall in Massachusetts, a pretty reasonable sized mall, but close to where I grew up. I went to the now long gone KB Toys, but inside there they had the structure decks, they had Metal Raiders packs, Blue Eyes, and I remember buying a Metal Raiders pack and a Yugi structure deck, Kaiba structure deck, sort of the basics. I pulled a Barrel Dragon out of the Metal Raiders pack, so a pretty good hit.
That's pretty nice, and it looks
pretty
cool.
Good. That was pretty good. That was a pretty good card. Yeah. And that was
you were hooked immediately after that. I knew that was it.
Even prior to that, I was playing like fake Yu-Gi-Oh with Pokemon cards, right? I was trying to replicate the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh with Pokemon cards with my cousin at the time, and
that's a new one.
Yeah, right. That was totally weird, but for me, one of the big driving forces is that close to where I grew up, about a 10-minute drive away, was a local card shop. And had that card shop not existed, I don't know what would have ended up happening, because just buying packs is one thing, but going to a store where there's 10s and 20 and dozens of other people playing is huge and really important too. And I remember going to my first local. I remember the round one opponent, his name was Rob. I remember after the match, after he just destroyed me, he looked at my deck, told me you should probably cut Garnelius Elefantes, which was a no effect 2400 2000 monster, had the same stats as Red Eye. So I thought it was pretty good because of that, but obviously not very good. Told me to pick a theme and stick to it. I remember I picked Fiend as sort of the first theme. Eventually when Dark Necrofear came out, it seemed like just the greatest boss monster to go in this Fiend deck that I was building. And from that point, it was a long journey, but that is where it started. From the TV show to opening packs at the mall, the Burlington Mall, to realizing that there was a store close to where I grew up that was going to have weekly tournaments.
So when does it...
TP1. That's how far back I go, TP1.
So where does it become competitive? Where do you, because I have the similar story like you. I started, same way, essentially, the TV show, the anime, and then I kind of transitioned into, this is a real life thing as well, playing it with the people at my school, et cetera, et cetera. And Fiends was also one of my first decks ever. But where does it become competitive for you? So now the next step is you don't want to be trash anymore. So
I think for me, looking back at my playing career, that's a weird word to use, but I'll just use my career.
Yeah, I say career.
I think it is. There's sort of moments where a really big event happened and then it was on to the next goal. And for me on the local scene, it was always to win locals. But when I first started, early teens, even before I was a teenager, I just wasn't very good. I struggled. Sometimes I'd get out of the first round. It was a single elimination tournament. And for me, my goal was always, I need to win the Batters Up local. That was a huge motivation at a young age.
Real quick. Were you always really tall? Were you like a big kid?
I was always sort of on the 90th percentile, if you want to use those.
Okay, so you were a tall preteen.
Yeah, I was always relatively tall. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So
all right, go ahead.
That was sort of always the driving force. And it's beginning of Batters Up, the locals were actually pretty big. I mean, we're talking about so big that we had people playing on the floor because the actual playing space didn't have enough tables. So TP1 days of Jinzo and everything, I mean, there were 40, 50, 60 people going to these locals. But as time went on, the size of the locals dwindled. And the local was never overwhelmingly competitive, though I will say early Yu-Gi-Oh! Before the days of YCSs or SJCs even, the types of decks that people ran were always all over the place, right? Ordeal of the Travelers, Guardian Sphinx. I mean, the decks didn't really have the refinement that they would have in the following years. But for me, early on, I would go to that local every week, but the size would dwindle and eventually got to a point where I ended up winning. It was during what would have been technically GOAT format, but my local scene wasn't overwhelmingly competitive and we weren't actually running GOAT control. I was running a zombie Sacred Phoenix deck. But I remember calling my parents and saying, I won my first local, and sort of that moment and that feeling of winning. But it was like a 12, 15 person local. At that point, the size had dwindled. It really wasn't overwhelmingly competitive, but it still meant a lot in the moment.
Yes,
for sure. What you said is true. At that time, like, I don't know, the internet wasn't as common. Not everybody just played the same deck or a variation of the same 3 decks, right? You go to your local and there'd be like the one guy that plays Clown Control every week. And then like this other guy that plays a question deck and, all that random crap.
I showed up the local playing Warrior Toolbox. It was my first local tournament. I played Warrior Toolbox and I played the Dark Necrofear Fiend deck with like 3 Slate Warrior, 3 Giant Orc, 3 Archfiend Soldier. Death Devastation Bar, the Goblin King for sure. Yeah, that was like my first. Those were my first decks. That was before I realized that chaos. I didn't know that metagame.com was a thing. That's how far back.
I'm gonna get to that for sure.
Yeah. It's cool because nowadays, like especially a lot of even less competitive players, people that just play at locals, will still update their decks for the meta. But back in the day, you'd have a guy that's like, no, I'm an Archfiend player, and month after month they play Archfiends in some way, shape, or form, or like an Amazon player. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely existed, especially Galaxy. Kenny, you know about Galaxy in Philly. That was like one of my first locals, and we definitely had. Every person was like, he's a dinosaur. Yes, he's a dinosaur player. He's a zombie player. Like the guy Cam, who was on our No Way Home Spider-Man episode, he played Fiends. He was known as like the Fiend player. He always played Fiends no matter what. We had other people who only played like insects, etc. So kind of like the TV show, we all adopted a theme and we all played that theme. Yeah.
Yep, very similar. In GOAT format, at the end of GOAT format, the final GOAT SJC was actually in Boston, and I'm from Massachusetts. I didn't actually go to that Shonen Jump, but I did hear about it. And for me, that introduced me to the idea of, there are actually events beyond just these 15 people showing up at Batters Up. And the following year, the next time the SJC circuit rolled around to Boston, I was aware that it was going to happen, and I made plans to go there. So the very first event beyond Batters Up that I ever attended was the Shonen Jump in 2006, the one that Bobby Chambers won after Chaos Sorcerer was banned, and sort of that it wasn't an emergency ban, but they pushed the ban list up a month so they could ban Sork ahead of time.
Yeah.
But it was that event. And after that event, that night, I was introduced to Metagame because I heard that site was used for the coverage of the event, and I wanted to go home and read the coverage. Right? I saw all of these isolated areas where these were feature matches, and I was really curious, what is happening over there? Are these like best players? So I went home that night, and I mean, it might sound weird, but it's almost like I fell in love with that website because I went back and read every single article, every single deck profile match, everything from the entire history, from the very first Shonen Jump or even the first the US Nationals, all the way up to the Shonen Jump in Boston. And the second day that I went back on Sunday, I obviously didn't qualify for Sunday, but I recognized people based on the coverage. I was like, that's Dale Bolito. That's Anthony Alvarado. These are the names of the top players that I saw not only do well day one, but do well throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, maybe even win Shonen Jump throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Now I see them in person. And then there was that, it just sort of clicked. Like this circuit, this environment, this competitive scene is something I really want to do. And then it was, all right, how do I find out where the next regional is, the next Shonen Jump? And I would soon, over the coming years, play regionals and Shonen Jumps. And
it's actually interesting.
To be more competitive. I guess I would be 15 years old because it was 2006, but that's really where it triggered. Like, I would like to be competitive. I have sort of already hit the peak of Batters Up because I remember going back to Batters Up after the local that I had been referring to. And at one point I could never even get out of round 1 or 2. But at this point, even without competitive decks, I was pretty reliably winning because it just wasn't a very competitive scene. And I remember I showed up with a Cyberstein deck with Cyber Dragons and the Borgs cards that I wasn't really playing before. And then not only was I winning, it was just kind of like crushing the competition because now my deck was actually super competitive. I wasn't very good, but I was playing what I saw off metagame.
Yep.
And at that point, it sort of reached the peak. I can't really progress as a player in Batters Up. And I needed to look elsewhere. And for me, the next store, a little bit further away, was in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is actually the city that I went to college in. So it's a pretty important city for me. But there was a store there, Larry's, and it was at Larry's that I went into a little bit more of a competitive scene. The tournaments were way bigger than they were going on at Batters Up. And at Larry's, it's where I met Paul Clark. It's where I met CJ Lack.
Ah, yes.
I would eventually meet Jimmy Johnson. I'd get introduced to Duelist Grounds. I mean, all of these just massive, important events in my career happened at Larry's. And when I went to Larry's, I started getting crushed again. It was like, okay, great. I had reached the peak of Batters Up. I won every week. Now I'm going to Larry's. It's like, this is the big yard. Like, this is the next level. And I'm getting crushed every week again.
That first feeling when you started getting crushed again, was that exciting or depressing? Or a little bit of both?
I remember the first deck I ran there. I built this sort of wave motion burn deck, sort of built off of a deck that Max Suffrage used at a Shonen Jump years prior called Countdown Control. So I had this sort of Clock Tower Prison wave motion deck that I put a lot of work into. It's actually one of the reasons why my original name on Duelist Grounds was Wave Motion, because I loved this idea of a deck that had Clock Tower Prison in a format with only a couple back row removal cards. and I just got crushed. And I don't think it really was sort of depressing or anything, but it definitely forced me to say, okay, enough of this, off the grid burn deck. I should probably start to actually play real decks.
I want to say something. You mentioned how metagame was like the beginning of you pretty much becoming competitive, and I think it's interesting how you and our past pretty much mirrors each other. Like everything you're saying, it's almost like you are saying verbatim